Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Jessie Mahoney. She's a pediatrician and certified coach. Today's Kevin MD article is What If We Stop Sacrificing Ourselves to Practice Medicine? Jessie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so tell us what led you to write this article in the first place, and then tell us about the article itself.
So, what led me to write this article was actually a talk that I gave for pediatricians and adolescent medicine docs who are part of a lifestyle medicine group. And they were really wanting to talk about how to make change and how to have a practice that you really want. And was so clear that so many people have this desire to practice medicine in a different way, in an authentic and aligned way. And they don't know how to do it, and they don't know how to get there. And there's sort of this stumbling block wall. And so the talk that I gave for them was really about what are the thoughts in our brain that keep us from being able to do this and keep us from being able to use these incredibly smart brains that we have to build practices that are aligned and offer great care and that sort of meet everybody's needs. And the primary one that comes to mind is that we are supposed to sacrifice ourselves and be a martyr, and that it isn't about what we want or what we're interested in, rather than sort of thinking what in medicine we want and are interested in could actually bring the most benefit to the culture of medicine, our patients, and ourselves. And so it started with that, but I have talked for a long time about this culture of self-sacrifice and martyrdom in medicine. And when I graduated from residency, it was like, if you weren't a self-sacrificer and a martyrer, I'm not sure those are words, but you weren't a good doctor and you didn't care. And that was really the litmus test for who cared and almost deserved to be a doctor. But since that time, and I graduated right around the time that medicine switched from more private practice to managed care, in this new model of medicine, that's not functional and it's not sustainable. And it's something that essentially just leads to burnout and leads to dissatisfaction. And so that being sort of the primary thing that gets in the way of change. There are a lot of other things that get in the way of change, but it struck me that if you're really looking at sort of the linchpin, it's really this idea. I like to think that we're here to give care and we're here to take care of people, but not to be a self-sacrificing martyr. And that actual, if your intention and your drive comes from that, which for every physician, it really does. That's how we got here. Leaning back into that can get us out of all this noise in our brains about judgment and what will people think and what if I make a mistake. But that this idea of being sacrificing and that being required really gets in the way of all of us practicing good medicine. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about it on the podcast, though, is that I've received several emails about this article. And I mostly work with women in medicine because I'm a woman in medicine, except for the institutional work I do. All these emails came from men, which really surprised me. And so this idea of self-sacrificing and martyrdom is really a universal concept that really hits home to a lot of people, and that many people in medicine want to shift or want to lean into a more authentic way of practicing it, but get stuck on this idea of self-sacrificing and martyrdom. And one of the things that came up in these emails, which is not really addressed in the article, it's subtle, is this idea that because that's a culture, we judge our colleagues about whether they're self-sacrificing and being a martyr. And so we make it even harder to make a change, and we all tend to feel more stuck. And I just thought that was kind of a fascinating twist on something that I've talked about for a long time. So I thought it'd be worth having a conversation here.
Yeah. So talk to us about that culture of martyrdom and self-sacrifice. I think it starts all the way from people who want to be doctors, right? These pre-med students. My daughter is a pre-med in college, and that culture of self-sacrifice already is instilled in her from the very beginning, and that only perpetuates and persists throughout medical training, internship, and residency. So talk about how much that self-sacrifice is already so deeply embedded in the culture of medicine.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's in part deeply embedded in a lot of cultures, but medicine's probably, and I'll put in quotes, the worst, that we have these unspoken rules that we're here to serve. And serve comes from the root servant, by the way. And so really just to recognize that I think we're here to care. And so it's the language. But if you have to sacrifice to get into medicine, I will actually say that's required. And it isn't that is in and of itself a problem, sacrificing here or there. We always make sacrifices as we're negotiating life and competing priorities. But to recognize that that's not the litmus test of good medicine or being a good physician. And so the unspoken rule is really, we have to practice and serve and learn and study to the point of depletion. But we actually know from neuroscience that that point of depletion is not where we learn the most. So if you're in medical school, that's not where you learn the most. It's not where you have the most creative solutions, and medicine requires creative solutions. And it's really this idea of sacrificing is very depleting
Mhm.
energy. Whereas you might do the same studying from a point of, I love medicine. I find pathology and immunology fascinating. And then you're not as depleted. And so
Mhm.
to me, it's literally the language that we're using about it and the litmus test of judgment around it that is causing the problem. Because I would say to be in pre-med, it does take some sacrifice. To be
Yeah.
a resident, it does take some sacrifice. Now, certainly we can change the culture, but it isn't that that is bad. It's really that this idea that that's what makes us healthy. And there's shame if you want things to be different or don't want to do that. And yet, from neuroscience, you actually know that, shame keeps us out of learning and growth and being the best doctors we can be. And so it's actually this sort of negative spiral circle that's really contributing to burnout. And could we, all the way back, I'm thinking to your daughter who's a pre-med, but all the way along, like create a culture where we can love medicine and still be healthy humans, and that good medicine is not equated with sacrificing yourself. It's equated with caring for yourself and others.
So I want to get back to the room where this article was drawn
Yeah,
from, that talk that you gave with all the
yeah,
other
yeah,
physicians who were there. So give us a sense of some of the stories that you heard. What kind of practices they're in? Why did they feel stuck? So just tell us what that climate was like in that room, and what were these physicians specifically looking for from you?
yeah. Well, this room had a very specific climate in that these are people who are all part of the lifestyle medicine world, which is
Mhm.
a world where many people are heading because they want something more from medicine. They want medicine to be more about health than illness. And so these are folks generally who work in employed positions who want to be able to bring in more health and wellness and nutrition and stress relief and figuring out how to have a practice that feels creative and feel stuck because either they can't do it, they don't have the resources, they're in their scarcity mindset, they might be afraid they'll fail, they don't want anybody to be disappointed in them, and they don't want to make a mistake. And they're certain there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And so they're kind of in this spot of stuckness of,
Mhm.
I would like to do something different, but this practice that I'm in potentially doesn't have room for it. Sometimes it does. We just aren't sure how to ask, but it's
Mhm.
really that sense of, I really want to do something more. This isn't why I went into medicine, but I don't know how to get there.
All right. So we talked about the climate, the issues, what it is now. So tell us about some of the interventions. How can we dig ourselves out of this culture of martyrdom and self-sacrifice, knowing that it's so embedded or entrenched in our culture? What are some of the first steps that you recommend and counsel physicians?
Well, part of it is actually noticing that that's how you think and
Yeah.
that your brain is constantly dropping into this idea that I have to do that in order to be accepted and welcomed and thought highly of, which is really important to us in medicine. In fact, we have a lot of trauma about being judged in medicine. If you go back to med school and residency, and even in our practice, like we tend to judge each other harshly. And if we get judged, something bad can happen, is
Mhm.
what happens in our mind. And so the first thing is to notice that you're coming from that. The second thing I actually say is really calm and doing that nervous system work,
Mhm.
because you can't change and move forward from this fight or flight reactivity cortisol bath, which is where we all are in medicine, right? So the idea is we have to take not only good care of ourselves, but of our nervous system. So learn tools to breathe is one of the most simple ones, but learn tools to unwire a little bit, to have a better balanced nervous system, because that's the only way you're going to successfully move forward. You can push yourself, but then you run out of willpower, which is always what happens in
Mhm.
medicine anyway. So I think the calm nervous system, it absolutely takes courage. I think many people think that it'll just be easier. It's actually the harder path to forge your own path, and just to recognize that it takes courage. And most of us like being courageous, but we don't step into that. And so to understand that it's not the easy pathway, it's the harder pathway,
Mhm.
but can be the more rewarding one. And then I also like to think capacity is another one. So your nervous system has to have capacity, but you also have to sort of slow down and you
Hmm.
have to have space and time to think. Many people want to do this on top of everything they're doing. And very often we need a pause. I've seen most people be successful. It could be a sabbatical. It could be taking a few hours a week to focus on this and think about it. It could be doing a short retreat, but some kind of space where you're not depleted and below empty because
Yeah.
you can't make choices. And that's actually when you have martyred yourself, you're depleted and below empty. And so most of us actually stay in a system and positions that don't work for us in that state. And it's a little bit self-fulfilling, right? Where we martyr and then we feel stuck and that's all we can do. I think the other really important piece is community. And very often we want to do this by ourselves. And so having the support of and just sharing physical space with people having the conversation. So I was giving this to a group of people who all felt similarly. That opens up the possibility of having the conversation. And I actually work with a lot of women physicians in groups where they all of a sudden they don't feel alone. They recognize that there are paths and seeing other people do it makes it less scary.
Yeah.
And so that I think is just a really helpful way. Thinking about how you can support yourself. And you can do a retreat or you can do a coaching group, but you can also have a community of your med school friends who maybe support you or who've been through things. But recognizing, I think that we don't have to do it alone. We're so used to doing alone and feeling isolated. And feeling isolated triggers your sort of danger in your brain.
Hmm.
And then it's much harder to do it. Your capacity drops. And then it's also just really a commitment. Like it is hard and you don't know how to do it until you've gotten to the other side. The recipe in medicine, our recipe for success is follow these boxes. And when you're trying to step out of this self-sacrifice martyrdom culture, there's not a checkbox of how to do it. You're really forging your own path. And so it just takes reminding yourself constantly that, people aren't going to necessarily agree with you. The person who goes first is the one who sort of does it on their own. And so you really are often the person in your practice going first.
Hmm.
But you're modeling for others what healthy medicine can look like. Because I think even as I say it here, that old, like deep-seated, like, well, someone's going to think that I don't think we care about patients or we don't want to, do what we're supposed to do. And it's not that. I actually think that by not sacrificing and by not martyring, we actually care more. Like it will create a culture of medicine that's sustainable. That's the highest bar. And I don't think that means you have to leave medicine or you have to have a direct primary care practice. You could just change the culture in your practice,
Hmm.
that it's a caring culture that cares for the caregivers and you and your colleagues and the patients and all of these things. And that's a very different energy than self-sacrifice and would be sustainable if we were willing to take the risk to jump into it. But it's definitely feels risky in our current culture.
So that first point that you said, there's a certain amount of irony that the current path of martyrdom actually is the more difficult path, but ultimately less rewarding.
Yes. Yeah. And well, and potentially they're both difficult. I think
Yeah.
sometimes we're like, if I leave, it won't be difficult. Well, they're both going to be difficult. It's just which difficult you want to work through and where do you
Hmm.
want to end up?
In your article, you ask a question as a starting point. What would love do? Right. So talk more about that question and how physicians can use that as a starting point.
Well, this is my favorite question. And I see medicine as really a loving, caring culture. And so if you feel like love is a little mushy, you could replace it with care.
Mhm.
Okay. But it's really this idea, it's an activating energy and it's making decisions from an energy of love or from an energy of possibility and hope, which are all sort of encompassed in love, rather than making a decision from fear or frustration, or I
Mhm.
can't do this anymore. And the way of asking it is really asking yourself, what would love do? And then for me, what would love do for my patients? What would love do for my colleagues? What would love do for the culture of medicine? And you can see as you ask this question, it wouldn't self-sacrifice and martyr, right? And so it gives you this real access to creativity of
Mhm.
like, well, what kind of a practice would love create? Or how might love tweak my 15-minute visit to bring in things that make me feel alive or bring in some joy or bring in some connection or hope, even to patients. I think it allows us to step outside of the box And I think nobody doesn't want to move through the world, hopefully, nobody in medicine from a place of not love.
Hmm.
I do sometimes say, because I use this language in coaching and my writing a lot, is that in some cultures, love would self-sacrifice and martyr. So I always make the point that if that's true for you, use the word maybe peace or use the word maybe care. What would peace do? How would peace move forward? What kind of practice would peace build or what kind of practice would love build? And you can tweak the language if your background immediately says, well, love equals self-sacrifice and martyrdom. And it's kind of interesting that those two overlap for
Hmm.
many people. And so I really do think if you think about, well, love for yourself, what would that do? And we tend to never consider that. And yet, physicians are some of the most brilliant minds and the most caring humans. And so, if we acted from this place of authenticity and care for ourselves, I think we could bring so much more to the world.
We're talking to Jessie Mahoney. She's a pediatrician and coach. Today's Kevin MD article is What If We Stop Sacrificing Ourselves to Practice Medicine? Jessie, as always, let's end with some take home messages they want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I think this message that different is possible and that the self-sacrificing and martyrdom is not sustainable. And so sustainable medicine, which I think of, green and a sustainable planet is really the highest bar. And that would really come from practicing from a place of love, caring, peace, and a sense of coming alive rather than our litmus test of being self-sacrifice and martyrdom. I think the last message would be is it has to start with you. I think we
Mhm.
wait for the culture to be accepting of it, but it's going to take individuals standing tall and leaning into what they want to bring to the world of medicine rather than this old culture of being in a place of depletion is the highest bar.
Jessie, as always, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. And thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.